My name is Håvard Bekken. I'm a senior researcher at the IFS. I will chair this last panel. To keep most of us here as long as possible, the organizers saved the real treat for the final session, namely a small but very promising panel on what Galeotti would call the murky aspects of Russian political life. The informal actors defined here, I think, we should say by their informal status, but also by their relations with the Kremlin. Sometimes, or quite often, I would say, Russia today is referred to as an autocracy, but it is also sometimes referred to as an adhocracy, because of exactly this pragmatism, improvisation, ad hoc solutions, and reliance on informal actors in various schemes and in various ways. So first, we will hear from Jardar Østbø. You know him already as an assistant professor at IFS and as the big boss of the Recyclable project. He's an area specialist. His research interests are pretty wide within the topic of Russia and also Albania. And he has been publishing in the Russia-related leading academic journals. Within the Recyclable project, his focus is on power relations and foreign policy. And today he will discuss the role of informal actors in Russia's engagement in Africa. Jardar, please take my place.
Thank you. Thank you also for referring to me as the big boss. So, in 2013, two prominent Russian academics and former diplomats predicted a full-scale Russian return to Africa towards the end of the decade. Now, this decade has officially ended, and Russia is officially back in Africa. Last October, President Putin welcomed 43 African heads of state to the lavish Russia-Africa summit in Sochi, the first of its kind and incredibly expensive. In his welcoming speech, Putin stated that cooperation with Africa is one of the priorities of Russian foreign policy. So why should that be so? Well, the Soviet Union's relations with African countries were extensive, hence there's a sense that Russia has already invested an enormous amount of money in Africa. It just goes a bit back in time, and now, if ever, there's the time to reap some of the benefits. Russia is also, as many other countries, is also in critical need of some minerals that are found in Africa, or mostly in Africa, or even only in Africa. According to some sources, the highest leadership gave orders to cover up this lost ground and place people in strategic locations. Africa is also presented as the continent of the future, where there's a huge profit potential, immense natural resources up for grabs for those who can handle the local conditions. African countries also represent 54 votes in the UN General Assembly, as well as many votes in other UN and international bodies. It's increasingly important for Russia to have a great power status. Internationally, sanctions also mean that Russia has to look beyond the West for trade opportunities and political alliances. And the Russian foreign policy establishment is in favor of a multipolar world order where Russia is one of the undisputed leaders. Finally, but very importantly, Africa is a place where Russia can show defiance against the West by supporting incumbent authoritarians, sometimes even dictators that face the hard conditions of the Western-dominated liberal or Western-dominated international structures. Conditions such as demands for democratization or neoliberal economic reforms. So in international relations, Russia is perhaps even increasingly presenting itself as the defender of state sovereignty. So these last 2 points are arguably the most important. Russian trade with Africa is very small. In 2018, it was $20 billion, which is not very impressive when compared to the European Union's 334 billion, China's 204 billion, and even Turkey's 30 billion. Now, 30 African countries have so-called military technical agreements with Russia, but so do even some NATO members due to their continued use of Russian-produced arms. Russia is Africa's biggest supplier of weapons, but 80% of this export, of our Russia's arm exports to Africa, goes to one country, namely its longtime partner, Algeria. But in addition to this, Russian non-state actors can also offer informal services to African states outside, obviously, official channels, and these are of relatively low cost to Russia, also to the recipients, and often, not always, but very often, come in addition to official support. And I would argue that the political significance of these so-called services is high. Often, these services are associated with the infamous businessman Yevgeny Prigozhin, also known as Putin's cook. According to a source of a Russian investigative journalistic outfit, Prigozhin in 2017 was able to pitch the idea of increasing Russian influence in the third world at the expense of China. So, who is this mythical Prigozhin? Well, St. Petersburg native, spent most of the 1980s in prison for theft, robberies, and fraud. In the early 90s, after a stint as a hot dog vendor, he went into St. Petersburg restaurant business, allegedly under the wings of organized crime. As a restaurateur, he was now able to make local political connections, and thereby he gained possibility to host important events. Later years, his company has secured near monopolistic catering contracts for the Russian army, also for the school system in Russia, primary schools. He was indicted by the US authorities in 2018 for his role in the alleged meddling in the presidential election through the infamous so-called troll factory that used a network of fake social media accounts to spread divisive messages. Prigozhin is widely regarded as a patron of the private military and security company known under the name Wagner. Some sources claim that it was actually the Russian General Staff's idea to establish a private military company for certain tasks back in 2013. Prigozhin was selected for the task. Reports have it that he wasn't overjoyed, but it was an offer he couldn't refuse. If this version is correct, it's a good example of how patron-client relations work. Prigozhin has many powerful enemies. He has several criminal and administrative investigations hanging over his head, just waiting to be activated. Nor is he particularly close to Putin, contrary to what is often claimed in Western media. But by being useful to the state, he has at least so far been able to get away with a lot of things. Now, after initial success and then failure in Syria, Wagner forces have become more and more important in Africa. In what is seen as a leaked internal document of Prigozhin's company, 39 African states are listed as countries of interest to him. These structures, allegedly under Prigozhin's control, provide African rulers with what we can call an informal sovereignty package. There's a private security forces and political consultants or political technologists. They're more often called in the Russian context, implying a more active role than the mere consultancy. So in return for this package, the structures typically request access to natural resources, for instance, gold, diamonds. The The political technologists are or have been active in 20 African countries, according to the aforementioned leaked internal documents. And an independent TV channel last year estimated that between 100 and 200 of Prigozhin's political consultants were working at the time in African countries. As a rule, they offer political advice to the incumbent leadership, however authoritarian and dictatorial, as long as they stay in power. They, for example, developed a strategy to help Sudan's Omar al-Bashir, who faced international charges of genocide and crimes against humanity, to regain control when he was challenged by a domestic protest movement. The strategy, which was leaked, obtained by the press, elaborated on, among other things, how to smear the opposition and suppress the protests with, quote-unquote, minimal but acceptable loss of lives. Wagner forces were also deployed to back up Bashir militarily. But when the dictator was deposed in April 2019, relations continued under Sudan's Military Transition Council. In the neighboring Central African Republic, Russia has, following the assessments of Prigozhin and company, considerable influence. Officially in 2018, Russia secured a UN mandate to provide 150 civilian and 5 military instructors, as well as an exemption from the arms embargo to supply some light weaponry to the country's military forces. France had then withdrawn its military forces from the former colony a year before. But Russian non-state actors are more deeply involved. Valery Zakharov, a Russian former police officer, and according to media investigations, what could be classified as a Wagner employee, is the president's President Tuadera's security advisor. And Wagner forces serve as security detail to the president. They're also reported to be training local forces, and then they're thus blurring the boundary between themselves and the official UN-sanctioned Russian training mission. Wagner forces are said to operate 4 airfields in the country, including the runway built at the deserted residence of the former president, where they have set up camp. When a Russian brokered peace agreement between the government and various, like a dozen rebel groups in Central Africa was signed in 2019, a source from Prigozhin's circle hinted that he had played a role, although he had not participated in the official meetings. So the price for these services seemed to have been that a company called Lobaye Invest, credibly linked to Prigozhin, has been granted extensive mining concessions for diamonds, with which the country abounds. In Libya, as another example, official Russia plays the role of a peace broker between the UN-supported government and the main rebel commander, General Haftar. However, Haftar has also previously been visiting Russia on his own, and famously, Prigozhin was spotted at the Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu's talks with Haftar in November 2018. Wagner forces are reported to be fighting on the side of General Haftar in his efforts to overthrow the UN-recognized Libyan government, who claimed that they could document the presence of up to 800 Wagner personnel in the country. Smaller deployments of Wagner have been reported in a number of other African countries as well. So since private military companies still are illegal in Russia, the Wagner Group finds itself in a legal gray zone at best. They can be regarded, or some regard them, as a tool for Russia to pursue foreign policy objectives outside formal channels. At the same time, they're normally independent. Some sources claim that there is no doubt that Prigozhin's actions in foreign policy were agreed to by the highest leadership, and that there is also coordination on the lower level, with the Ministry of Affairs Department of Africa. But Russian officials vehemently deny any involvement by the state in these ventures. The president's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has stated that Vladimir Putin does not know about Prigozhin's activity in Africa, and the foreign ministry spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, has said that she didn't know anything about it. So the semi-legal status signals to foreign heads of states, even warlords, that Russia, as a wider entity, has several levers to pull. The criminal image of Prigozhin himself, his alleged role in the meddling in the US elections, his role in supporting authoritarians and dictators, send a powerful signal that he does not abide by the rules of civilized society. Russia does not have the economic clout of the US or China, but Russian non-state actors offer tools for African incumbents to strengthen their sovereignty. By contrast to Western aid and support from international organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, whose loans depend on economic deregulation, democratic reform, Russian investments and support come with no strings attached, at least no visible ones. Hence, Russia is attractive for the regimes and national elites whose privileges could be threatened by the political and economic reforms required by the Western and international structures. For some, it could also be an opportunity to provide a counterweight, however small, to the massive Chinese involvement on the continent. Anton Morozov, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the State Duma, stated during the Sochi Russian-Africa Summit, quote, "Our policies never aim to impose our cultural values, our democracy standards, and so on. We always respect the sovereignty of our partners. So in that sense, it's much more beneficial for the African countries to cooperate with Russia than other countries, including Western states," unquote. So in a sense, while the West can offer democratic submission, Russia offers sovereignty, uses it as a strategic resource. In return for this sovereignty package, it gets foothold in strategically important countries with abundant natural resources. It also demonstrates defiance against the West, presenting itself as an alternative. The high price, however, for Russia, we can say, is that part of these efforts to gain a status as a global great power, in a sense, depend on a criminal former hot dog vendor. Thank you.